Okay, hi guys. Welcome back to more political chatter. I have made a map that I think has never been made before. I have mapped the best performing third party candidate in every single US county ever in American history. So, before we go through and take a look at specific areas that are interesting, a couple of things to note. There are a lot of things to note, but some candidates, some people I don't consider third party candidates. Like, for example, 1860, I didn't include at all. I didn't include John Breckinridge of the Southern Democrats or John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, just because there was a party swap at that time. They were completely changing dynamics, and they were all essentially major parties in that election. In the time of the election, they were all considered major parties and not third parties. So I didn't include them. And then, of course, 1824, all were Democratic Republicans, etc. Basically, I think the very first person on here that is the best performing third party candidate that I consider third party would be 1832, William Wirt of the Anti-Masonic Party. I think that one is the very first. Unless it's like John Hale. No, John Hale's way later. Um, and then a couple of other things. In some states, like independent candidates, especially in southern states, were officially nominated as a Democrat or Republican. So, for example, in South Dakota and Oklahoma, Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 was actually nominated by the Republican Party. William Howard Taft was nowhere on the ballot. Now, this also happened in various southern states. In 1948 with Strom Thurmond, nominated by the Democrats, and George Wallace in 1968, nominated by the Democrats. But in most of these states, Harry Truman and Hubert Humphrey were still listed as quote unquote independent Democrats or some variation of that. So since the actual Democratic nominee was still on the ballot, I still considered them third party candidates, while Roosevelt in South Dakota and Oklahoma, I did not. So I think that's it. And also in some states like Colorado, Nebraska, Nevada, Kansas, 1892 People's Party, Populist Party nominee, James Weaver. Sorry, yeah, 1892, that's right. What he was the nominee of the Populist Party, but Democrats didn't even put up a candidate. That's why he was so dominant in those four states. It was a two-way race between him and Benjamin Harrison, the Republican. You're going to get a much larger vote share in a two-way race rather than a three-way race, which is an advantage he has in those four states. With that being said, let's take a look specifically at some of these states. So let's start in my home region, the Northeast, in New England. This one is kind of interesting because of how scattered it is. Now, you might notice Ross Perot, unlike basically every single other person on this list, Ross Perot does not have a single base of support. His support is absolutely scattered from Southern California to Oregon to Utah, he was very strong in. All the way, even in southern states like Oklahoma and Texas, he did very well in Florida, and all the way up to the Rust Belt, Ohio, and then New England. So Ross Perot won some counties, of course. You had Teddy Roosevelt. And then William Wirt dominated in Vermont. This was the one state he did win in the 1832 election of the Anti-Masonic Party. And then New York was very chaotic. But New York, you had mostly Teddy Roosevelt and Millard Fillmore splitting the tri-state area in around New York City and Long Island. Then as you move up north, you did have some Ross Perot counties, but it was actually Martin Van Buren of 1848 from the Free Soil Party. That is who dominated the more you go up north. Moving down to Pennsylvania, you also have more strong support for William Wirt, which is surprising. I don't know why he was so dominant in southern Pennsylvania, but not New York at all, or upper Pennsylvania. Also Erie, the western part of the state, he did very well in. Some Millard Fillmore counties, but it was Roosevelt who dominated. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt did win Pennsylvania in 1912. In New York, Roosevelt also dominated here, somewhat surprising since Roosevelt did not even carry New Jersey in 1912. And then you enter the border states where it's Millard Fillmore who does by far the best. In Maryland, he wins all but two counties. In Delaware, he wins all three counties. He moved down, and Millard Fillmore was from the Know Nothing Party of 1856. This was a nativist, anti-immigrant, sort of xenophobic, white supremacist party. You move on to Virginia, more dominance by Millard Fillmore. That really surprises me. I don't know. I thought he did better in the Northeast for some reason, or the South. I wouldn't expect these border states to be as strongest. But I mean, but look at Kentucky. Look at Virginia. Millard Fillmore was pretty dominant for considering the fact that he didn't do too well in the election. He only won what 10 to 15% of the vote, something like that. And then, but once you start to enter Virginia, you start to enter George Wallace territory. Now you're starting to get some Wallace counties, even some Strom Thurmond counties in the most southern counties of the state. You have some, and what's really odd is the strength of progressive politics that used to exist in the Rust Belt, or I'm sorry, in the Appalachian Mountains. As you can see, the only sort of southern counties that Roosevelt does well in are these Appalachian counties, right around West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee. And what's interesting is that I also mapped the support of George Wallace in the 1968 election. He dominates all across, except there's a huge gap in the Appalachian Mountains. So that is something odd that I picked up on, but still Millard Fillmore for the most part does dominate. Especially in Kentucky, as you can see there. Also, T. Coleman Andrews, worth noting, did very well in Prince Edward County, Virginia. That is the single county that he won. He actually did win the county, but in this matchup between all the other third-party candidates, that is the one he took. Wait. Oh, whoops. Whoops. Okay. Didn't mean to click that. That is for T. Coleman Andrews. States' Rights Party, by the way. And then you move down to North Carolina, and it's basically all split between the nativist Millard Fillmore and the segregationist George Wallace. But then you move down to South Carolina. Strom Thurmond in South Carolina and Mississippi absolutely dominated. I don't know. I don't remember why he dominated so much in these states. Because, George Wallace, I am counting as a third-party candidate in this state. So it is interesting that he just absolutely dominated in 1948. I don't know why. In Georgia, it's Wallace country. Alabama, Wallace country. Note Thomas Watkins of the Populist Party in 1908 won Oconee, Georgia. And then some more populist support for James Weaver in a couple scattered counties, which surprises me. Not too surprising is that Millard Fillmore, I cannot say that name, I don't know why. The former president in 1856 does win quite a few counties in Georgia. Moving down to Florida, the northern part of the state, not a surprise, all Wallace country, some Thurmond counties. Then as you move more south, Ross Perot does do well among these, more older counties, right? Broward, Palm Beach, Martin, etc. And then Mississippi is the other state Thurmond absolutely dominated in. Again, Wallace, I am counting as a third-party candidate, though, apparently, because he did win just a few counties. So that is just so interesting. And then you move on to Louisiana, where Thurmond does do well. Thurmond and Wallace just about split the counties. And then it's all over the map. And then you do have, this is super interesting, the Progressive Party in 1916 did not put up a nominee. They were planning on running Roosevelt again, but he did not want the nomination. They ended up putting nobody as their nominee, literally the name none, and they actually did put up a vice presidential nominee. The home turf of this VP nominee, I think his name was John Parker, I want to say. I don't know why I know that. That could be wrong. The home turf, Southern Louisiana, they did win a couple of these counties. That's super interesting. You've got Arkansas, it's Wallace country. Tennessee, very, very, very split between Fillmore, Wallace, and then a few Roosevelt counties in Appalachia. You've got Ohio. For some reason, Ross Perot did very well here. I don't know why. Fillmore did very poorly. It just stops after Kentucky. You had this strange um, southwest corner where Wallace won a couple counties, La Follette won a county, and then we get to our first Eugene Debs County in Butler, Ohio. Butler, Ohio, Eugene Debs, the best performing third party candidate. And then as you move more towards the north, you see that it is Roosevelt country, right in this more blue collar working class area. You've got a couple more Martin Van Buren counties there, and then La Follette actually dominates in the cities. Um, that is where Cleveland is, in Cuyahoga County. And then we approach our second state, the first being Delaware, Michigan, where one candidate won every single county. Teddy Roosevelt dominated, absolutely dominated in the state of Michigan. He won every single county. He was the best performing third party candidate in every single county. The same is not quite true for Indiana. He did do well. He won the most counties of anyone. But Millard Fillmore won some southern counties, and then you had Ross Perot win a few scattered counties, and then Martin Van Buren taking Grant. Illinois is quite interesting. Millard Fillmore dominated, and when you look at the numbers, dominated in Chicago and Cook County. I don't know why. I really don't know why. Looking at this coalition, very odd coalition. And then you have the rest of the northern portion of the state won by Roosevelt easily. And then the southern part of the state is very much split between Millard Fillmore, Ross Perot in the east, and then Robert La Follette in a couple of these southern counties. And then let's go to Missouri. Strangely strong Ross Perot state. Again, I don't know why. Um, who knows? I would suspect Fillmore would do better here if it was a state in 1856, which I'm assuming it's not. You have some Roosevelt counties, some populous counties, Wallace in the southeast, definitely expected. And then you actually have James Weaver, not from 1892 of the Populist Party, but he ran 12 years prior, in 1880, from the Greenback Party, basically the forerunner to the Populist Party. And he actually won a good portion of votes in the southwest portion of the state. I don't know why, and then it just stops when you get to Oklahoma and Arkansas. Let's go up to Iowa. Very scattered, but for the most part, Roosevelt did well. And now you're starting to approach La Follette country, right? These progressive, very rural counties in the Midwest. La Follette dominated in many. James Weaver 1880 county there. And then you get to Wisconsin, a near total sweep for Robert La Follette in his home state. You only had Kenosha, which went to John Hale in 1852 of the Free Soil Party. That is John Hale's single lone best performing county. And then Van Buren win also of the Free Soil Party. I don't know why, but the Southeast, they loved the Free Soil candidates of Wisconsin. In Minnesota, La Follette dominated for the most part. A few populous counties in the Northwest, a few Roosevelt counties scattered throughout. And then in North and South Dakota, very split, or not really. It's mostly dominated by La Follette, but James Weaver did put up a very good fight in 1892, winning along the eastern portion of both the states. Very odd. Then you approach the three states where he was one of two candidates listed on the ballot: Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska. Absolute domination. You get to Oklahoma. Ross Perot wins for the most part. Wallace wins the eastern portion. And then look at these socialist counties scattered throughout. Eugene Debs in 1912 carries a good portion of these counties. But look at Allen Benson from 1916. I was not going into this thinking that Allen Benson would be the best performing third party candidate in any county. But he was in three: Seminole, Kiowa, and Dewey. And then we're going to save Texas for last. Best for last. This was a fun one to do. It was insane. Montana, La Follette, Perot, and Roosevelt. Wyoming, Perot, La Follette, and Weaver. Utah, mostly Perot, some Roosevelt. Evan McMullen, of course, from 2016, the independent candidate, won 2. Eugene Debs won Wob. Idaho, La Follette and Weaver. Washington was La Follette and Roosevelt. Out west was very much La Follette country. In Oregon, it was Weaver and Perot. Perot did very well. I don't know why La Follette fell so far behind. Nevada, of course, dominated by Weaver. You had California, strong for La Follette. And then even Fillmore won some counties. Eugene Debs in San Francisco. Arizona, you had Roosevelt domination, some La Follette counties. In New Mexico, mostly Perot, not too much of a surprise. Some Roosevelt support, some La Follette. And then 2 counties for Gary Johnson in 2016 in his home state. That's interesting to note. Hawaii, and then for Perot, and then Alaska. I'm sure you guys all know the county situation in Alaska. They record their votes by some odd way, so I wasn't able to add it to the map since those are the counties. And then we get to Texas. Look at Texas. When you look at, you could see most candidates, do particularly well in Texas or in certain states. You could look at Ohio and say Perot did the best. You could look at Wisconsin and say La Follette did the best. But look at Texas. Absolute chaos in these ultra rural northwestern counties. Wallace clearly performed the best. In sort of the far, you had Wallace perform best in the far west portion of the state, but also in the far east portion of the state. Wallace did very well in these more conservative, more segregationist areas. And then as going from the east to the middle, in the southern part of the state, you sort of had very strong support for Millard Fillmore, which is interesting, as you could see all these yellow counties. So odd. And all in between, you had support for James Weaver in 1892 of the Populist Party, all throughout. You had some support for Roosevelt in these heavily Mexican areas of the state. That makes sense that they would vote progressive, or at least not surprising. You had one single Strom Thurmond County. You had some support in this certain area in Texas for James Ferguson of the 1920 American Party, a right-leaning party. And then right next to that, you had the only county, best performing third-party candidate, quote, black and tan Republican electors, 1920. That was a Texas-based party. In the early 1920s, they never put up presidential candidates, but again, black and tan Republican electors. They split from the Republicans. They put up their own electors. They were the best performing third-party candidate ever in Fort Bend. Alson Streeter of the leftist Union Labor Party, basically socialists, of 1888, won 3 counties, or didn't win, you know what I mean. You had Wharton Barker of 1900 Populist Party, right after James Weaver, trying to continue that momentum, but failed. Won 2 counties. Oh my god, sorry. I'm not trying to click it. Let me change it. You even had the Prohibition Party. Despite them being like one of the longest running third parties in America, or maybe the longest running, it actually is. Out of the entire map, the party ever only was the best performing third party candidate in one single county, in Texas. Silas Swallow of 1904. You had a strange base of Eugene Debs support in Crosby, Dickens, Ford, Cottle, etc. And then in Washington, you had the Texas Regulars, who were Democrats who opposed Roosevelt and the New Deal. They got Washington County. And that's it. There it is. If you have any questions, let me know. Oh, John Anderson, by the way, in Washington, D.C., and Alexandria and Arlington. And yeah, there it is. So thanks for watching. I will see you all next time.